So our topic tonight is violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. And we wanted to start with opening statements to get a sense of where this is, where these issues are on your agenda, what significance that they will have within your administration. So you have 60 seconds each, and the question is, how will you address violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people in your first 90 days in office?
As you all know, domestic violence is not an issue of the rich or the poor in particular. It's not an issue of black or white. It's not an issue of people who live in Chicago as opposed to the suburbs. It's not an issue of women versus men or gay versus straight. It cuts across all swaths of the community. And so it's very important today that we train our gays in this mayoral campaign on this all-important issue and what are the steps that lie ahead. And I'm pleased to introduce Sharmili Majmudar, who is Executive Director of the Rape Victim Advocates, who will introduce the rest of the program tonight. Sharmili?
Thank you, Dean Krent, and the Chicago-Kent College of Law for hosting the first City of Chicago Mayoral Candidates Forum on violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. As Dean Krent said, my name is Sharmili Majmudar, and I'm the Executive Director of Rape Victim Advocates, also known as RVA. Along with RVA, this forum was organized by the Center on Halsted, Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, also known as CASE, Chicago Foundation for Women, and the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network. We welcome you to this important event, and thank you for being here. Our organizations are all committed to ending domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, exploitation, and other forms of violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people through direct services, policy and legislative advocacy, and public education. Together, we all provide essential services to the residents of the City of Chicago. As the mayoral election is approaching, 1 week from today, we believed it was important for the public to be educated on the strategies and plans the next mayor would implement to address violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. While conversations about crime and injustice in our communities often focus on what happens in the street, there is equally important and damaging harm perpetrated behind closed doors. Women have lost their lives at the hands of their partners and former partners at an alarming rate in the City of Chicago. Every day, girls are trafficked and forced into prostitution by threats of violence and the need for food and shelter. And an astonishing 1 out of every 7 adult women in Illinois have been raped in her lifetime. Bullying and discrimination make schools unsafe for LGBTQ youth. And recently, Chicago Public School students named domestic violence and sexual assault as top agenda items that they wanted the next mayor to address. The leadership of the City of Chicago is obligated to ensure that the city provide the highest quality services to survivors, prevent future violence by holding perpetrators accountable, and empower communities with the necessary tools and resources. All 6 mayoral candidates were invited to participate tonight. Gary Chico and Rahm Emanuel declined. Miguel Del Valle will be attending, but will be late due to a previous commitment. We are very fortunate tonight to have as our moderator WBEZ's Allison Cuddy. She's the host of WBEZ's award-winning weekday news magazine show, 848. And prior to becoming the full-time host of the program, Allison served as the senior producer, of Chicago Matters, the year-long series examining various topics of broad interest to this region. Allison will be also speaking about the format of the forum tonight. And thank you again for all of you being here, and please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Allison Cuddy.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many people out here, so many people thinking about what is going to be a historic election in this city. I am going to spend a couple of minutes going over the rules of the road, as it were, for our forum this evening. The questions for tonight's conversation were developed by the sponsoring organizers of this forum. That's the Center on Halsted, the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, the Chicago Foundation for Women, the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network, and Rape Victim Advocates. Now, candidates will have 60 seconds for their opening statements. They will have 90 seconds for each response to the questions that we go through. It's at my discretion, the moderator's discretion, to ask follow-ups, but any responses to follow-up questions should be brief, 30 to 60 seconds. Rebuttals will also be allowed at the moderator's discretion, and again, they should be short, 30 to 60 seconds. And we have a timekeeper here in the front row. So when I call time, or when you see the flash, please do conclude your comments for us. You must conclude your comments when your time runs out. We are going to begin this evening in the order that our participants are seated. So we'll start with Carol Mosley-Braun. We'll skip Miguel because he's not yet here, Miguel Del Valle, and then William Doc Walls and Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins. For closing statements, we'll reverse the order, start with Patricia and end with Carol. So our topic tonight is violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. And we wanted to start with opening statements to get a sense of where this is, where these issues are on your agenda, what significance that they will have within your administration. So you have 60 seconds each, and the question is, how will you address violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people in your first 90 days in office? Carol Mosley-Braun.
Thank you very much. When I got to the state legislature, I filed legislation requiring landlords, or prohibiting landlords from refusing to rent to women, or most often women, with children in their apartments because there was no husband involved. Now, why was this important? This was important to me at the time because I had grown up in a family in which there was an abusive relationship, and when my mother and father split up, she could not find a place to live with 4 children. And so I decided as a state legislator to change the law, and I did. When I got to the United States Senate, I was a co-sponsor of the Violence Against Women's Act because this issue played such an important role. Since that time, I have kept up as a volunteer in the private sector to help pursue those kinds of issues, serving on the Cathedral Board for Homelessness and serving on the North Lawndale Employment Agency Board. In the first 90 days, to get quickly to the point, I think the most important thing to do is planning, to increase efficiency and service delivery, to bring the stakeholders in collaboration to develop specific goals for concrete objectives such as prevention, intervention, whether it's with health, police, housing, legal, and then long-term support, and culturally and linguistically appropriate and LGBT support.
Time. William Doc Walls, in your first 90 days, how will you address this issue of violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people?
Good evening, Dean Krantz. It's a pleasure to be here in my alma mater. I'm a graduate of Kent College of Law, not at this facility, but 77 South Wacker. It's really important that we establish a great relationship with the state of Illinois, because the state of Illinois is really critical to the enforcement of the laws and ensuring that, for example, we completely examine all evidence in rape cases. Recently, the governor signed legislation that will allow us to do that, but it's an unfunded mandate. The state of Illinois, Department of Police, State Police, has not had the ability to complete rape kits. That's really important. We also have to make certain we unify this city by promoting cultural and diversity sensitivity amongst people of all ages, races, socioeconomic backgrounds, all religious persuasions, all sexual orientations, and all physical and mental disabilities and limitations. We have to develop commissions and boards that include persons who are of various distinctions.
Time. Thank you. Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins, the question to you, how will you address the issue of violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people?
Well, my number one concern, and one of the reasons that led me to run for mayor in the beginning, was the fact that violence runs rampant in our streets, and I see very little engagement with community residents to solve those problems. Murder is the leading cause of death in Chicago for people under 35, And I know from experience that the teens are experiencing a lot of violence, the girls, and even some of the guys are experiencing a lot of violence. I think number one, what needs to be done is, which I've pushed across the board, is to use evidence-based models, bring in evidence-based models that bring down violence. And we're not just talking about shooting, but we're talking about all kinds of violence. Also, programs like Ceasefire, which is a street-level intervention program, which engages people on the street and talk to them, give them an opportunity to share their ideas and what they're experiencing, and come up with solutions. Number two, safe passage. The youth tell me that's one of the most important programs we have in Chicago right now is Safe Passage, which provides access to and from the school in a safe manner. And as mayor, I will fund that program. It's not funded by the city now. It's funded by the federal government, and it ends in about several months. So I will fund it and support it.
Time. I'd like to ask a follow-up of you, Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins, because many of the programs you've outlined, Ceasefire, for example, are aimed at gun violence and gang violence, and I'm wondering which of those programs do you think would be effective in addressing domestic violence or sexual assault or rape?
Ceasefire, it's advertised as gang violence, but it's all about violence, period. It's about violence in the neighborhood, bringing violence down. So we also work on domestic violence cases, work to try to raise awareness, because the main thing is people are kept quietly enduring that suffering alone. It's about raising awareness and bringing people together to solve those conflicts. Safe Passage is the same way. Protects them to and from school, and that means a lot to the kids.
Okay, let's move on. One of the big topics in this election in general is the issue of policing, and all of you have stands on what you would do in terms of changing up the way we police in our city. You've talked about changing the leadership of the Chicago Police Department. We want you to talk about policing in relationship to domestic violence, to sexual violence, and the first question is, the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network Court Watch program at the City of Chicago Domestic Violence Courthouse found that Chicago police officers will ask victims of domestic violence to sign as witnesses on blank complaints. These complaints are used to generate police reports on domestic violence crimes. When these cases get to court, there are often findings of not guilty because the police report and the victim testimony do not match. So, I mean, that's one example of a shortfall in policing around domestic violence. What will you do to ensure improved police response and attention to domestic violence cases? Carol Mosley-Braun.
Well, at the outset, it is a matter of training of the police, so they are sensitive. I think there's been a huge sea change, actually, in terms of the way that the police deal with these issues, because there was a time when, particularly if it was domestic violence involving a police family, there were never charges filed. Now those charges must be filed, and I think that was a step in the right direction. Making certain, however, that the police have the sufficient training and sensitivity to accurately assess and document the occurrence it will require some work and some effort and some leadership in the police department. And that's something I think we still have some work to do on. It is not unusual to have the police report and the actual occurrence or a victim. As I experienced when I was a victim of a mugging, my report and what was on the paper were different, and that almost gave rise to the perpetrator getting off. So that is making sure that there are the connections and the collaborations so that the court system is not that removed from what actually comes out of the station house when these reports are done. That's one thing. The second, and I keep pressing this in all of my conversations about the police, and that is the community has to be involved with self-policing. That is to say, it's not just law enforcement as a top-down kind of exercise. It's also law enforcement on the cultural and on the community basis. So if the neighborhood, if the people in the area have a cultural sensitivity to domestic violence, are there to either support the victim of it or report the perpetrator of it, that will go a long way to helping us.
Time.
Help.
Sorry. The clock is a very strict taskmaster. Remember, you do have 90 seconds for these responses, so you have a little bit of stretching room, but not a lot. William Doc Walls, your response to this question.
We have to adopt a policy of zero tolerance as relates to domestic abuse and violence in our communities. And that starts with the police department in terms of the procedures, policies, the practices, and also in terms of making certain that the domestic abuse coordinator within the police department is engaged and involved, and that they're ensuring that letter of the law is followed so that we don't have police officers who take these complaints casually and don't complete the paperwork in the fashion that they must be completed in to ensure that the victim is well represented in court and that the victim has the very best opportunity to be protected by the courts as well as the police department itself. Protection is essential. It's critical. We have to understand how important this issue is, and we cannot downplay the significance. It ought to matter anytime anybody feels threatened. In some cases, we have persons who are nonviolent offenders who aren't a physical or psychological threat or danger to any other human being being played upon by other people. We got to make certain that we protect people in our environment, protect people in our communities, in our neighborhoods. People have to feel safe at home. We have to make certain that the city is proactive in ensuring that those individuals who do feel threatened are informed anytime an offender has the potential to be in their neighborhood and in their area. Again, it goes back to making certain that we're cooperating with the state.
Time. Thank you. Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, to keep from repeating what was just said, I definitely agree with what Doc Walls has just spoken about. But I'm the only candidate that has said that I am not categorically going to dismiss Jody Weiss. And the reason why is because under his leadership, murders are down in this city. And to me, that's very important. And also, police misconduct cases are down. So I'm an advocate for getting things measured and getting things done. Because what gets measured is what gets done. So I think it's important for us to raise the domestic violence as one of the major issues that the police department needs education on, and also follow through and community organizing. The community must become a part of solving the problem. You have to feel like you got a safe place to go. I mean, I was once in an abusive relationship, but growing up in my house, my mom taught me. She told us that we didn't have to suffer that, and we had a way out. And I took the way out. I mean, I left out of there with a broken arm, but I got out, and I could have lost my life. So I understand that it's important to feel empowered and have support. And so I want to make sure that that happens on a community level, and also that the police department is well aware and engaged, because we will measure the outcomes and how these cases are being treated, and what the outcomes are, and how people feel about what they've experienced. Because just because the case is settled and just because the perpetrator goes to prison or gets punished in some way, it doesn't mean that the victim has really been satisfied or been protected in that situation.
Well, your comments set us up for our next question, which relates to sexual violence. And according to the Chicago Police Department, there has been a steady decrease in crime in the city of Chicago, including in the number of criminal sexual assaults. However, the city's 4 rape crisis centers have experienced either no decrease or an increase in requests for service over that same time period. Additionally, a recent report by the Chicago Justice Project reveals that 50% of all investigations into felony sex crimes over the course of the last decade were suspended. So this goes to, it seems that there is a growing need for rape crisis centers, and there's also problems in terms of investigation of some sexual assault. So what steps will you take as a mayor to improve police response and investigation of sexual violence? And William Duckwells, why don't you start us off?
Part of that is the responsibility of our Department of Human Services to make certain that the Department of Human Services is adequately interacting with rape crisis intervention organizations. We have to stop rape before it occurs. Oftentimes there are warning signals. We become desensitized in this society. Sex is one of those things that's talked about on television. Back in my day, it wasn't. When we were coming up, it was rare to see anyone kiss. So people begin to believe that that it's okay. Not too long ago, a few years back, the Supreme Court here in the state of Illinois ruled that sexual consent could be withdrawn even during the course of sexual intercourse. And we don't adhere to that. We have to strictly enforce that, because anytime a person feels uncomfortable in the sense that they're being engaged sexually, we have to make certain that they feel empowered to say no. We have to empower those rape crisis intervention organizations to interact with our police officers and get the respect that they deserve when they walk into those police stations and when they're talking to police officers, so that they're not being dismissed, because they are representing and advocating for people who really need help. So we have to ensure that they feel empowered and that we have sensitivity training so that our police officers understand the importance of allowing them to advocate fully on behalf of their clients.
Time. Carol Mosley-Braun.
You are correct, and one of the issues with police reporting generally and the so-called declining crime statistics is that they change definitions and they change the way things are, what boxes they go into, and the result is what looks like a decrease in crime in one category may just be that half of it's been renamed. And so I think that's a real problem, the honesty and transparency of the systems used to report crime. And that's something that I think I would be interested in changing right off the bat. But having said that, I think one of the big problems with providing services, and that for me is the bottom line, is how do you get services to the people that need it? How do they know that the services are there and available for them? And I went and did a little research on my own, and it turns out that part of the problem, as might be expected, is that we have all these silos with activities kind of separated from one another, activities that are really related and should be looked at kind of in a holistic way. Under the Violence Against Women Act, again, which I mentioned earlier, I've been a sponsor, there were 21 different grant programs, 4 different hotlines, one for domestic violence, one for sexual assault, one for stalking, and one for dating violence. Well, that's all well and good that you got all these different hotlines, but if you're a 15-year-old girl who's just been sexually assaulted by your date, which one of these do you go to? How do you pick out what to do next? And for me, that is the bottom line issue. How do we resolve the barriers to transparency and the barriers toward access for all the people who need to access those services? Having these programs may be well and good, but if the people can't access them, we have a problem.
Time. Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, number one, as I said earlier, when we measure things and we report out on those measurements, we're likely to get things done. We know that the dollars are down in the city and that we don't have a lot of money now. So I'm a proponent of supporting organizations that do this kind of work, that are watchdog groups and groups that are doing research and reporting on these issues that are already, many of them are already supported in one way or the other, but I want to empower them by having a real partnership with the city to move this agenda forward. We, as you said, that the rape and the different sexual cases have not come down, and other cases have come down, but we're probably just looking at the tip of the iceberg, because most people probably don't even feel free discussing what has happened to them. So we have to create an atmosphere where that kind of conversation can happen, and I think that happens when we make people feel free and safe and to talk about the challenges that they have, and that's best done to me in communities where community members are knit together and working together to solve problems. If we're raised in a household where it's we're known to be silent or told to be silent about things like this, then it's likely that we won't speak out unless we have another avenue, another way out. And I'm supporting community organizing to be a part of that process, to bring people together and give them a place where they can come and talk about what the challenges are, and also come together to create solutions to address those problems.
I want to follow up with both you, Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins, and you, William Doc Wallace, because both of you invoke this idea that we need to encourage people to feel free to talk about these things frankly. The question presumes that people are able to talk about them, that they are seeking counseling. You know, they're looking for rape crisis centers, and they can't meet the demand, and that they are going to the police to report sexual assaults, but those investigations aren't being carried forward. So just, can you clarify how you would address those two things? I mean, lack of services and kind of a lack on the part of the police to actually fully investigate these crimes. William Doc Wallace.
Mm-hmm. As I indicated, our Department of Human Services is wide and it's sweeping, and it talks to people. They talk to people at their lowest ebb. So the key is for us to, when we come to talk about no heat and no electricity, to also talk about the other conditions around the person's life, to make certain that they understand that they can avail themselves to other services, including services when they feel uncomfortable. Our caseworkers with the Department of Human Services are trained to be pretty receptive, and we can further train them to sensitivity in that area. The Chicago Police Department can also be trained, and that's why I indicated the person who's responsible for domestic violence within the precinct. They have a whole department. They have to be better in terms of reaching out and just making certain that people who are likely to have been victims of abuse are contacted, followed up with, and made certain that they know that the services that are available to them are readily available.
Okay, Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, as I said earlier, I think it's important for us to rely on communities to provide that level of support. We know dollars are down. We can't say we're going to put more money, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in the program when we know we don't have the money for it right now. But what we do have is each other. And if we are able to create an atmosphere in the communities where this is a conversation that's being had and that people are brought together, we have a better chance of addressing those issues. I've learned that many times there are plenty of opportunities and programs available for people in our communities, but they don't know anything about it because the community is so disorganized. And so that's why I'm a proponent for community organizing, that the community itself will become organized like Logan Square Neighborhood Association, Organization of the Northeast, Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. I think we should empower these groups to be a catch-all for these kinds of challenges and help people to find solutions based on what's available, what resources are available in the neighborhood, and also to find the social, emotional supports that they would need to make it through those challenges. So I know there's not enough money, and I know that the police are not doing right, but we cannot just look to government alone to solve the problems. It has to come from within the people who live in these neighborhoods who can raise the issues in a collective manner.
Well, we'll come back to the issues of transparency, access to information, and then funding of services. I want to welcome Miguel Del Valle to the stage, our fourth candidate this evening. We're in the middle of a series of conversations related to policing of sexual violence, sexual assault, and I'll just move on to our next question. This has to do with the Independent Police Review Authority, and maybe we can dig a little deeper again in terms of how we get the police to move forward investigating these cases so they can be prosecuted. There's an ongoing dispute between the Chicago Police Department and youth perceived to be LGBTQ. According to reports and research from Incite, Women of Color Against Violence, and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, LGBTQ youth, gender nonconforming youth, street-based and homeless youth, and youth of color experience police harassment and violence. How will you work to ensure that the Chicago police treat LGBTQ youth of color with respect and dignity? You've talked a lot about sensitivity training thus far around these issues, so I want you to try and be a little more specific in your responses to this question. Carol Mosley-Brown, I'll start with you.
Well, as I've mentioned many times, I come out of a police family, so I know what goes into evaluations, and I really think that if you begin to put somebody's job on the line based on how they treat the people they're supposed to serve, you'll go a long way to getting better conduct and nicer behavior in regards to those people. Again, I use the example of domestic violence in police families. There was a time when domestic violence in police families was ignored. It happened almost always. Almost never was a report made. It was just something that was hushed up and not talked about. The rules got changed in the 1970s that says if you beat up your wife, your job is on the line. Guess what? The incidence of that kind of violence fell dramatically. The same thing with regard to conduct with regard to LGBTQ youth, a non-traditional people, the police encounter. There has to be there has to be a level of respect. There has to be a level of service, and they ought to be called on the line when there is a complaint that they have not. And being called on the line does not necessarily mean going over to getting a couple of days off work so you can go before the Independent Review Board, but rather something that goes right to the bottom line of your evaluation that will impact on your ability to get promoted, your ability to move forward in the department. And I know the people in the department care enough about that. And you put it there, and I believe that that a lot of the bad acting that we're experiencing right now will come to a screeching halt.
Just quick follow-up. How do you implement that ability if this kind of harassment is happening with youth, we understand that there's a real power differential between a police officer and a young person on the street. So what kinds of mechanisms would you set in place to allow that kind of reporting to happen to the police such that it does become part of the evaluation of a particular officer?
Exactly. Well, that's when I kind of got to the end of my last statement and my opening statement kind of cut that part off, which is to get rid of the silos and to give people opportunities to access services where they live, in the communities in which they live. Miguel, I'm not going to plagiarize, but I do want to use one of Miguel's favorite expressions, which is an organized community is a strong community. If you organize to allow people to access services where they live, then there will be some friendly venue in which a person can say, Officer ABC, whose star number was 123, harassed me on the street for no good reason. And then that report can be made and verified, and again, goes right to the bottom line. I think that'll cut a lot of this bad acting out in terms of the conduct of the everyday police officers.
Okay, Miguel Del Valle, what would you do to ensure that officers of the Chicago Police Department treat LGBTQ youth and youth of color with respect and dignity?
Well, first of all, it starts with establishing policies within the department that are clear, policies that address training, policies that address even initial screening of applicants for the police department. We do a process, we go through a process, and at some point it is determined that an individual, after they go through certain steps, are eligible to work for the police department. Well, at that stage, there ought to be, in the evaluation of a person's ability to do the work, there ought to be questions, and there ought to be a screening process that includes dealing with how it is that police officers treat every human being. And, I get frustrated sometimes when we talk about, during this campaign, about singling out one particular group and talking about how it is that we're going to ensure humane treatment of one particular group. Police officers should be treating everyone the same way. There shouldn't be any difference in treatment, any difference whatsoever. If there is a difference in treatment, then they're not conducting their job properly. So then that means that the training wasn't done, the initial screening wasn't done, and then the evaluation process that needs to be placed in place and supervision that needs to take place is not adequate.
Okay. Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, I think it's so important what Devalia just said about everybody being treated fairly, because being from the African-American community, I see the abuse all the time. And that's why I was impressed by Jody Weeds. And that's the reason why I said he's not gone. If I become mayor, I'm not going to just, fire him, because I saw a difference in the way the police were reacting to communities. And it's not just an LGBTQ problem. It's all of our problem. Because whenever anybody doesn't feel safe in the community, it's all of our responsibility to stand up and do something about it and say something about it. So number one, I think that the evaluations, as I said earlier, performance management, what gets measured is what gets done. Also, and as I said earlier, about communities not looking to the government to solve all our problems, but understanding that we have power and that we can solve some of our own problems, and what the government's job is to do is to provide leadership and support for that process. Number three, I said we don't have a lot of money right now. We know we're struggling. The state is struggling. Federal government, everybody is struggling. It's time for us to stand up and be counted as part of this country and part of this government. And that means speaking up and being organized enough to solve some of our own problems. And I'm willing to support that, not just with words, but with funding from the city to support communities that want to organize, whether it be LGBTQ community or a neighborhood, geographical lines. I'm willing to support it, because the only way our voices will be heard clearly and amplified well is when we're united and come together.
William Duckwells.
As I indicated earlier, we certainly have to have much greater sensitivity training, particularly in the police department, and we have to have interaction with our Department of Human Services. But we also have to have objective procedures when dealing with persons who have different lifestyles. A police officer should determine that that person does have a different lifestyle, and then there ought to be a series of steps that they're mandated to follow in their approach to dealing with this particular person to ensure that that person doesn't feel intimidated, isn't asked embarrassing or leading questions, and to make certain that everything that's done is done transparently. And then in terms of our Illinois Independent Review Authority, we have to make certain that they not only have the ability to evaluate a complaint, but they also have the authority to look at the record of the police officer in its totality. Currently, they only can look at the case before them. They can't look to see if there's a pattern of abuse by a particular police officer who's being charged or alleged to have committed some illegal activity. So we have to improve our procedures as it relates to that. And then we certainly have to empower our youth. I talked earlier about the person who's responsible for domestic violence, but there is a person who's also responsible for violence against people who are susceptible to that type of violence. So we have to have greater interaction between persons who might be victimized and those persons who are responsible for protecting them.
Time. Okay, you've kind of answered the second question that I was going to ask, and so I will leave you off on this answer, but I'll give you time if you want to add to it. Sure. Since the Independent Police Review Authority sits within the mayor's office, how will you ensure that reports of police violence are investigated with transparency and integrity? You've all talked about we need to have transparency, we need to have integrity. How would you ensure that this body actually has it? Miguel Del Valle, start with you. I should remind you, too, that you're limited to 90 seconds in your responses to questions. Rebuttals and follow-ups are at my discretion, and you'll have 30 to 60 seconds for those.
Well, I have not heard any real complaints lately from the Police Review Board. Evidently, a good job is being done. We want that to continue. But how many people out there in the communities are really familiar with the Independent Police Review Board? And so how many complaints are not being filed because of people not being familiar with the structure, with the process that exists? It's been a real low-profile office. I'd like to increase the visibility of the office so that people could make greater use of the office. And as mayor, we will certainly do that, familiarize people with the structure that is there that they can make use of when police officers are not properly conducting themselves and violating people's rights and being disrespectful and doing the kinds of things that they shouldn't be doing.
Quick follow-up, how would you raise the visibility of the Independent Police Review Authority? What's one example?
By way of making sure that people are aware of the existence of the office. You know, the mayor's office has 15 people assigned to press. First of all, we have to cut the budget, and one of the things I'm going to do as mayor is cut half of that staff. But those that remain have to work in conjunction, in partnership with the police department mechanism to educate the broader community about the structure of the police department. And that has to be done in conjunction with the mayor's office so that people see in the communities that the authority of the mayor's office is being placed behind efforts to educate the community about this structure and how to use this structure.
Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Thank you. I think it's so important that we have communities that are organized because, as I said earlier, when a community is organized, they're able to identify the challenges. They're able to identify the problems in the neighborhood. I've been in so many neighborhoods across the city and state, and when we bring people together and we talk to them about what the challenges are, they know what the challenges are in their neighborhood, and 9 times out of 10, they know how to solve those problems. The problem we have in this city is that the city barely listens to the residents. It's always a top-down approach. So I think when communities become organized, if we support community organizing, and they're able to identify, you better believe one of the things is going to be the police and community relationships. That always comes up. And then if the city is partnering with these community organizations, then we make them aware about where are the places that you look, where are the places that you go to make the reports you need, and also have them give them a way to report back on whether they feel like they're getting traction like they should. When we got ready to work on criminal justice reform, it took us a while to figure out who the real partners were, but we found out that the Illinois Retail Merchants Association had played a big part on what kinds of criminal justice reform could happen in the state of Illinois. Once we learned that, nobody had to tell us what to do. We went there. We went to them, and we partnered with them, and we worked with them and showed them why they needed to be our partner, and we moved policy together. And that's what I believe will happen as the city supports community organizing and communities are able to speak up for themselves.
Carol Mosley-Braun.
Well, simply, I think the most important thing is that people have a sense of what their options are, where they can go. And if it has to do with the police and police misconduct, There have to be outlets, community-based outlets, that are culturally, linguistically, and orientation, including disability, by the way, that are available and accessible to the residents who might encounter or have an issue like that with the police. They need to have someplace to go other than going to the police station to make a report where the police are so clearly in control of the situation and where they might not get the report taken seriously, or they might be blamed for bringing for bothering the police in the course of a busy day. That's very, very important. And I think one of the issues that we face here is that right now we are centralized in silos. That is to say, it's all top-down, it's all centralized, and again, the services are provided or made available in different silos. And those silos may or may not relate to the communities, to the neighborhoods in a rational way. And so an individual, I'm 15 years old, my date just raped me, and in addition, I'm pregnant and I don't know what to do now. Where do I go? We need to start so that that girl has an answer without feeling that she is locked out of government and that government has no place for her to take her concerns.
The next question has to do with. Oh,
I did
William
want to
Doug
just
Wells. Yeah,
add
did you want to add something? Thank you.
You know, one of the big fights in City Council recently was whether or not police officers who've been consistently accused of abuse would have their names reported publicly. And I think the answer has to be yes. When you find police officers who are consistently being accused by citizens of illegal activity, if nothing else, transparency requires that we make that known. Now, that doesn't mean that they're guilty. Of course, the Independent Review Authority has to determine that. But we shouldn't shield them when the same complaints are occurring over and over and over again. Thank you.
Okay. All of you have talked about empowering the community and letting them know what is available to them in terms of reporting these kinds of issues or getting information about how to deal with them. This question, like the question about the Independent Police Review Authority, goes to the structure within City Hall, within the city. So this has to do with prostitution and trafficking. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office and the Cook County Sheriff's Department are leading the nation in addressing prostitution and trafficking and holding perpetrators such as pimps and johns accountable. How would you, as mayor, get the Chicago Police Department and its leadership involved with the county's ongoing efforts and reforms? So again, this is a question about how do we get not the community to take this on as its mandate, but the police department to take it on as its mandate. Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins, why don't you start us off?
Well, I've been in a number of programs or projects that aim to do something just like that. It may have not been around prostitution. It may have been around gun violence, or it may have been around education. But what the city could do is form a task force, a round table, where goals are set for all county, state, and the city all come together and set goals for moving an agenda, particularly this particular agenda, forward. And then with the city's support, and they usually use one of the directors of one of the departments that will sit and be a part of that, and also other staff will be assigned to it to be sure that in the end that we're moving forward and everybody has their marching orders and they know how they're going to perform and how we will measure our outcomes. And so as mayor, I would definitely want to put together that type of roundtable, that type of task force that would not only include city, state, and county people, but also victims and people who are from the community who have gone through many of these challenges should also be a part of that discussion. And we should not only come up with what the problems are, but solutions, and then timeline and measurements that will prove to us whether we're succeeding or do we need to change courses.
Miguel Del Valle.
Well, first of all, we have to make sure that we have alternative forms of sentencing and that we work with individuals who need help, need assistance in getting out of the predicament they're in. I did that as a state legislator in my district office in the Humboldt Park area. We worked with women and assist them in dealing with their housing situation and dealing with other situations, and just gave them some hope. You deal with one life at a time. And at the same time, it's important that law enforcement cooperate. And that wherever possible, we can connect someone with an agency with a program, with a church, with an activity that will help them pull themselves out of that situation. The police department, I think, certainly has to continue to do a better job and work with other law enforcement agencies to identify the Johns and the pimps and those individuals who exploit women or men, for that matter, or youth. And that needs to be a priority. We see it on Cicero Avenue. We see it on other parts of the city. And people are not connected. The arrests are made. The individuals go to court, and then they're released. And this is too big of an issue to discuss in 90 seconds.
That may well be true.
Yeah. No, it is true.
William Duckwells.
Sure. The City of Chicago Police Department interacts often with our Cook County State's Attorney, and they have a task force that's specifically designed for that purpose. And the police are uniquely suited to do that because they're on the street. They recognize people. We certainly, as Miguel indicated, have to take care of those pimps and those Johns who exploit people who are in a weakened state, because the purpose of government is to provide for the common defense, ensure civility, and to take care of those who are weak, afflicted, infirmed, or disoriented, and to make certain that they are not taken advantage of by others in society who are in powers of position to do that. But we also have to make certain that people have jobs. That's critical and that's important, because when people are working, they're empowered. They don't feel as though they have to resort to, street activity to pay their bills, and they're not as likely to be exploited. So we certainly have to create jobs. And of course, I have a program to create 100,000 self-perpetuating private sector jobs for people in every neighborhood, good neighborhood jobs. We have to begin to empower people in the city of Chicago so people don't have victim status or victim mentality. And we're going to do that when I'm mayor of the city of Chicago.
Carol Mosley Ron.
One of my favorite television programs is Law and Order. And if you know, law, they talk about law and order. What they don't talk about even there is that middle part, how the law part connects with the order part. And one of the big disconnects we have in this community is between CPD, the Chicago Police Department, and what happens at 26 in California, what happens with the clerks, the court system, particularly in state court, much less the federal, but state court particularly. And so I think that making certain that as we do the planning, we focus in on the details of the collaboration between the police and the prosecutors so that a case is followed all the way through the process. That's why you have this court watch program, to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks, that the police don't neglect to prosecute a case that was important, that the people who are victims are handled appropriately and are given the kind of support that they need. The city ought to be a part of all of that, and that's going to require, again, developing that collaboration in the middle between the law and the order to make certain that the leadership and the law and the intent of the administration is carried out, and that these cases are given the kind of priority that that leadership would like to see happen.
Okay, we move on to a topic that many of you have invoked already, and this is money and funding. So we'll start big picture in terms of the overall budget. In December 2010, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability released a report showing how Illinois' budget cuts are hurting women and youth. The report, Gender Disparity in Human Services, explains that women and youth, LGBT youth in particular, are the most likely to need help with domestic and sexual violence, homelessness, and family planning. And these are the budgets that are being targeted most by cuts. We know the city budget is in the same boat as the state, but as President Obama said in his State of the Union speech, our cuts should not be on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens. So what will you do as mayor to balance our budget without disproportionately hurting women and youth? Where do you see the city feasibly cutting our budget so that these kinds of social services can continue? Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Thank you. As you all know, I'm a certified public accountant, so I've been thinking about this budget ever since I heard about heard about all the deficits they were projecting. and they are projected deficits of $654 million. Number one, I said I would perform a forensic audit. I would bring in a forensic auditor in to go through the books, to comb the books and look for waste and fraud and criminal activity, and then we will definitely prosecute those that have taken money from us. Because according to Dick Simpson from the University of Illinois, the cost of corruption here in Chicago and Illinois is $500 million a year. We pay that right out of our pockets every year, $500 million. And we pay it twice because we live in Chicago, so we pay it for Chicago. Then we also pay it because we're part of Illinois. Number two, and I know I'm only going to be able to cover these two in the forensic audit. And number two, that we are spending too much money on things that don't work. So 60% of our budget, our corporate budget, is spent on public safety, but yet we're not safe. I'm a proponent for evidence-based models, using evidence-based models that have proven to work so that we don't allow the women and the children and the LGBTQ community and other populations that really need the support. We need to be sure they get that support. I live in West Garfield, working in Auburn Gresham. I can show you probably 10 programs that are not worth the time of day, and we're spending money on them every day. And I think when communities are organized, they will be able to identify what they really need and how to use the money they have best.
Quick follow-up, are there programs that are currently in place that you would preserve at the city that you do think are working, especially to address this issue of sexual violence against women and children?
Well, I don't know of any particular programs. I can tell you, 1, 2, 3 or 4 programs. I would look to this community to talk about what programs work. You tell me, you tell the mayor what programs work, and those are the programs that we will look to protect.
Miguel del Valle?
First of all, we just had an income tax increase of 2%. And certainly the president can talk about how we must protect all these services, but the president can print money. We can't in the city of Chicago, and the state of Illinois cannot print money. And so we rely on federal funding for a lot of things, and we rely on state funding. And the fact of the matter is that with this income tax increase, there still is a need to borrow dollars at the state level in order to pay bills of a lot of providers who have been waiting for many, many months. Once those bills are paid, I think as mayor, we're going to have to advocate to get a greater share of those state dollars to come to our providers in the neighborhoods. In terms of the city budget, we have to cut $650 million, probably more than that. But I can tell you one thing, folks. The people here today are probably the ones who are going to protect those frontline services the most, particularly human services in the city of Chicago, whether they be funded through CDBG block grants or through the human services component. It's the folks who aren't here tonight that you better worry about. And those are the folks who are getting multi-million-dollar campaign contributions and polls from the Retail Merchants Association, like the one that was released today, that shows Emmanuel has 58% of the vote. You got to be kidding.
Timing.
In the city of Chicago.
Time. Sorry.
See?
I'll finish up
Every
for you.
time I get rolling, I'm cut off.
Just when things are getting heated. Carol Mosley-Braun.
Well, gee, I didn't know about that one. They keep coming with these phony polls. Right now, there are a lot of different funding streams, and in some instances, those funding streams overlap. For example, there is a domestic violence group in the Chicago Police Department that's funded in that way. In the mayor's office, in the Department of Family Support Services, there's an office of domestic violence. I think that both are there serving an important function, but there ought to be some level of collaboration, conversation, or cross-pollination, if you will, between those groups, because they're both calculated to try to achieve the same kind of service delivery. So that's one thing that I think can be increased. The second is that, again, because there are the different funding pots, the mayor's office operation, a lot of that's funded through the CBDG, the Community Development Block Grant money, whereas some of the Chicago Police Department activities are funded through the Attorney General's Violence Against Women Act funding. And then we have some private sector, faith-based institutions funded independently under the Violence Against Women's Act. So I think that, again, part of this planning process that I mentioned in the opening would entail getting a census of what we have, where the funding pots are, what those funding pots are, so we can get a sense of how we can better utilize the funding that we have. We can better utilize, leverage it. So again, the objective has got to be service delivery, not just keeping people in jobs. It's got to be how do you get the best bang for your buck and helping these young women, helping the LGBT kids, helping the people who need the support.
Quick follow-up. Do you have a sense of where you would cut in order to ensure these service delivery programs?
We did not. I identified, when we first started looking at the budget issues, we went through and identified over $1 billion worth of savings just from what we're doing right now that could close the budget gap without raising taxes, because I started off saying the middle class has been taxed enough, and I was in favor of no new taxes. Having said that, there's a whole litany of them, and I can get the paper and tell you what it is, but none of it included cutting any of this, because these services are already underfunded, and if anything, what we have to do is to make sure that the funding they do receive is better coordinated so that we can get, again, greater bang for the buck out of the limited funding they have. The city ought to get out of the way of the people who are actually providing the service in this area.
William Duckwas.
Yeah, we have to do something different. We have a $654 million structural deficit. And as long as we have a shortfall between the revenue generated by the city and the inflationary cost of funding the same old patronage-bloated programs year after year, we'll never have room to expand or add new programs or services. As mayor, I won't raise taxes. In fact, it's essentially unwise to raise taxes during a recession. As mayor, what I will do is make certain that we cut those big government contractors, cut their profit margins from 30% down to 10%. We'll make certain that we cut the beautification projects, building planters down the middle of the road when we have real needs, real human needs. We'll cut the non-essential infrastructure construction and repair projects in the city of Chicago. And then we have to grow our revenue. To grow our revenue, we'll take $2 billion from our $8.5 billion capital improvement program, which is a spending program that addresses capital projects which develop or maintain assets with a long economic life. There are 4 areas of capital improvement concentration: economic development, education, transportation, and city infrastructure. We'll take $2 billion and give 2,000 small to medium-sized businesses a $1 million jobs creation grant so each of them can hire 50 people. That will enable those businesses to introduce their products, goods, and services into the stream of the national and global economy and bring new revenue, job security, and opportunity back to the city of Chicago. So we won't have to cut essential programs like the domestic violence programs.
Okay, thank you. You're all in agreement that we should not cut these kinds of programs. We should find ways to support them or at least consolidate them. I want to come to the lack of funding for sexual assault victims. Last year, the Cook County Board of Commissioners approved $275,000 in funds to support county rape crisis services. This is a modest investment, but it had significant impact on the community. However, the city of Chicago has not provided funds to support these services for survivors of rape. Is that a priority for you? And what would you do to create a funding source for rape crisis services? So, two-part question. Carol Wilson-Braun, start us off.
Yes, it is a priority, and yes, the money is there at the national level, certainly, and in the philanthropic, the NGO sector, to provide for that. The city just has not been very aggressive going after those funding sources to support this set of activities, and I would do everything I could to make sure that we found every nickel we could to make certain that these services are made available.
Miguel Del Valle.
Well, I'm not impressed with the county. $275,000 for Cook County is nothing, absolutely nothing. And so the county needs to come up with more, and then of course the city has to contribute, and we need federal and state dollars, and we need private dollars. But obviously, this is a tiny drop in the bucket, and as mayor, well, you have to advocate, and you have to pressure the state and the county to do more, but you can't do that if you're not contributing anything as a local government. And so maybe that's why it's where it's at, because there's been no leadership It hasn't been a priority, and for me, it certainly will be.
William Duckwells.
Yeah, no, that certainly isn't adequate. And keep in mind, the county had a 10% cut across the board, so that $274,000 now becomes $250,000. That's a shame. The thing that we have to do is make certain that we're funding essential programs that ensure quality of life for people. We have to do that here in the city of Chicago by taking away from some of those programs that are non-essential. And we have lots of non-essential programs here in the city of Chicago. If we'd simply pay attention to the needs of people and fund them appropriately and aptly, then a lot of the other problems that we have in society would go away. As we indicated, jobs creation is critical and important. We have to grow our revenue. We have to make certain that people are working here in the city of Chicago and reducing the numbers of incidences of violence against women, rape, and violence against those persons who have unusual lifestyles. We have to make certain that we're being proactive. We can't just continue to go along the same path. I suggest that we transition Chicago from a debt-to-fund services revenue and expenditure system into a pay-as-you-go revenue and expenditure system so that we're paying our bills in a timely fashion. This year alone, our debt service will be $605 million. That's money that we're paying interest on money that we're borrowing. We're paying that to the bonding agencies. When we stop paying that money out to them, that's more money for programs.
Quick follow-up. What did you mean? You just clarify. You're talking about different interest groups here. What did you mean by people with unusual lifestyles?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about people who don't work a 9-to-5 job, for example. I'm not talking about anybody's particular sexual, social lifestyle. I'm talking about people who work untraditional jobs, people who are panhandling, for example, people who call themselves squeegee persons. Those are unusual lifestyles. They don't fund themselves by working a 9-to-5 job. And those people become victims just like everybody else does.
Okay, Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
All right. Well, in order to support the programs that we know are most important, we have to grow revenue. We are not going to be able to use the same revenue source that we've had in the past and think that we're going to spend more money on new things. We have to grow revenue. So my idea to grow new revenue in the city of Chicago is to start a new entrepreneurs program, to waive all fees for all new entrepreneurs for the first 2 years. And this would give people a chance in Chicago who feel like they can create some type of job opportunities for themselves and maybe for others. They'll be able to become a business in Chicago with the support of the city. And by them having to pay no fees for 2 years and not have to worry about being got, because most small businesses, when I talk to them, they say they feel like the city is always out to get them. I think that will push us along to be able to get more revenues in the city, not only new jobs, but also new revenue after 2 years. If the business root, if it flourish, then they'll owe the fees. So that'll give us new revenue into the city of Chicago. Also, we know that small businesses provide most jobs here. 70 to 80% of our jobs come from small business people. So we need to support the small business community. We need to provide the essential supports for them so they can grow their businesses and not feel like that the city is going to take something from them or slow them down when they're trying to progress or expand their businesses. So those two things will bring in new funding. And then we have to make sure we're spending money on things that make sense, like what you're talking about. If we're not addressing the problem with rape, what's important? That should be one of the main issues, one of the main things we're thinking about supporting. And so funding the wrong things is wrong. So that's it.
Okay, so just clarifying, you say that developing entrepreneurship in the city would help raise revenues to fund rape crisis services at the city level?
I said to fund, what I'm saying is that money can be used to fund the needs of the city. And that we should be focusing on the things that are most important. And that's one thing the city has forgotten. It has forgotten what's most important to us. The city has operated from a business sector approach to everything, schools, housing, jobs, everything from a business sector's approach. It's time for the people's voice, our voices, to begin to guide the decision-making in the city.
Another quick follow-up, because that seems like a long-term prospect. And so as mayor, how would you prioritize rape crisis services and develop funding for them?
Okay, it's not that far away. I said 2 years. 2 years of waiving fees, and then we'll have a whole new source of fees coming in. And lots of people want to start their own businesses. I've talked to them across the city. But like I said, we're spending money on the wrong things. It's up to the community, this community, to share with the mayor what's important, what needs to be funded now, and what doesn't need to be funded, because we don't have unlimited amounts of dollars. So we have to use the dollars we have wisely. But you can't expect the mayor to sit in his office and know what's the best thing to do. It has to come from the people. And that's what I'd say. As mayor, I will look to you to bring answers and tell me what's most important to you to be funded, what needs to happen now, and what's not necessary.
We're going to move on to prevention and education, particularly in Chicago public schools. All of you have talked about the need to sensitize people to these issues, the need to train people in order to deal with them. CPS policy on dating and sexual violence prevention is the issue we're going to address now. And earlier this year, youth participating in the Mikvah Challenge's Dear Mayor campaign identified domestic and sexual violence as crucial issues they would like to see the mayor address. The Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women has developed a series of policy recommendations for the state, county, and city with input from anti-violence groups and youth. Many of these recommendations mirror the concerns of the Mikvah Challenge youth. Current CPS policy is that dating and sexual violence prevention education is optional. Would you support making dating and sexual violence prevention education at CPS mandatory? Miguel.
Absolutely. And again, the policies need to be established, and the Board of Education needs to adopt those policies formally, and then the principals of schools then have to guarantee that it is part of the classes where it is most appropriate to include that subject matter. But it is a matter of policy, and I don't understand exactly why there would be a reluctance on the part of the Board of Education to address that issue, because these problems have been around forever, for decades. And so the question is not whether or not there's a problem. The question is, how is the Board of Education establishing the policies that ensure that the subject matter will be addressed in an appropriate manner with students? Because students, as you indicate in the Mikvah Challenge program, students do want to talk about these things, and they want them addressed within the school system.
Quick follow-up, what would be an appropriate manner for you? I mean, what do you think the proper approach to the subject is?
By appropriate, I mean in the appropriate class, and whether it's through groups, whether it's through counseling sessions, the appropriate mechanism for ensuring that there's discussion and participation with the students is something that CPS will have to determine.
William Duck-Wells?
Yeah, no, we absolutely have to make it mandatory. It should be part of our civics class. People should learn in civics how to respect the rights of others. Your freedoms begin where another person's begin. We need civics.
We don't have it.
We will have civics when I'm mayor of the city of Chicago. We're going to go back and get reading, writing, math, and science, of course, but we're going to have civics, we're going to have history, we're going to have humanities, and that's why it's so important to have those classes. Vocational training, language, cultural sensitivity in our classes. We've got to go back to home economics so children know how to balance a checkbook. We've got to bring those things back that make people whole and give them an education that will enable them to follow their hearts, their minds, their talents, and understand who they are and give them the ability to pursue the American dream, but also to be good citizens. We have to teach them citizenship, sportsmanship, and scholarship. So I believe that if we make that mandatory through our civics classes, we will certainly have better citizens here in the city of Chicago, and we'll have less incidences. We'll have real prevention because people will understand what the boundaries are.
Carol Mosley-Braun.
This is actually a much more complicated question you just asked than it may sound on the surface for several reasons. In the first place, we have a problem with the fact that the CPS, Chicago Public School System, has so few school nurses who were before the people who would help guide young people in this area. Our ratio is 1 to every 725 kids in the system, which is ridiculous. You can't reach, one nurse cannot reach that many students. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have had an uphill battle in terms of sex education generally, and it has given rise to the fact to no sex education at all in more schools than not. So making something that's that kind of controversial mandatory almost is giving it a poison pill. I think that the answer is, one, to restore the proper ratio of school nurses that can provide some guidance to young people, as well as to have actual curricula in regards to teenage dating violence and rape and proper conduct, between teenagers in this situation. Zero tolerance for bullying, that sort of thing, can be part of a sex education curriculum, but it may be that it will have to be something that if a parent objects, that a young person can opt out of. It should be broadly available, but I think we almost have to leave the option to come out of it if the family, which, by the way, we want to get the families involved with these schools. If the family objects, then I don't think that should be sufficient to shut down the program for everybody.
Okay, quick follow-up. Where would you find the resources to, as you say, there have been these cuts at CPS, including the ratio of school nurses to students. So where would you find the resources to actually enable this kind of education to be taking place?
I think that goes to the heart of the reforms that both city government and the Chicago Public Schools, the police and fire, these departments require, to use the term, an audit in regards to where the money is being spent now. But there are all kinds of efficiencies that can be achieved just by drilling down on the administration, what is actually there. We have people at CPS working desks that relate to programs that don't exist anymore. And so I think that once we begin to simplify and redirect the resources that are already in the system, we will be able to restore things like art, music, physical education, health education, and school nurses and truancy officers, and also because it helps the teachers. Right now, the teachers are having to do a lot of these functions and it overwhelms and overburdens the teachers, overburdens them, and they need to be able to teach. And we ought to be able to provide these encompassing services to help support their efforts to educate our children.
Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, number one, I definitely say yes, we should. It should be mandatory. I'm not sure if it should be a class, a standalone class, but I know it should be mandatory. It should be something that's taught. What I would like to see it is taught through the regular course of study during the day. When I was at Truman College, we had a combined liberal arts and science class, and when we learned one subject, it intertwined other subjects into that subject. So if we were learning English, then we also had some science in that English. And I think that we have to start talking about these things in a different kind of way if we really want the youth to absorb it. Because if we just put them in a room and give them a dose of this and then they've done their requirement, that's it. It's going to be done with. But if it becomes a part of lifestyle and understanding of how we should grow up and how we should learn, I think that then it will stick with the kids. We spend more on education than any country in the world, just in case you didn't know, more than any other country in the world besides Luxembourg. So there is money to be saved in Chicago public school education, and it's going to take a mayor who is ready to take on the challenges that have to be taken on and be the champion for the children and for our future to really get down to getting us what we deserve out of our education system. I think that part of helping teachers learn how to engage this conversation across their regular lessons can be done through professional development and in-service programs. They can learn new ways of discussing these issues and new ways of solving the challenges that these kids are facing.
Our next topic is bullying, and I know this came up for some of you at the education forum held by WTTW. In 2010, Illinois' anti-bullying law in the school code was amended to define what constitutes bullying behavior in the school setting and to enumerate categories of students against whom bullying is prohibited, including students who identify as or are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming. How would you ensure that Chicago Public Schools implement the anti-bullying law? William Duck Walls.
Bullying is one of those things that serves as a real intimidator that often forces children to withdraw from school. A lot of children drop out of schools because they're afraid to go across gang lines or they're being intimidated and bullied in the hallways, sometimes in the classrooms. We need very specific rules in place to further accentuate our zero tolerance policy. Persons who bully people, whether it be people who are transgender or lesbian and gay, or persons who are simply trying to get an education but are being intimidated by gangs, have to be protected. The bullies have to be dealt with very, very swiftly. Zero tolerance with absolute certainty has to be the policy and the mandate of Chicago Public Schools. We need police officers who enforce that. We need teachers who aren't afraid to enforce that. We need principals and deans who aren't afraid to enforce that. Why? Because we have a 50% dropout rate, particularly among black males in Chicago Public Schools. And many of them are forced out of school because they're afraid to come to school, because guys are trying to force them to join gangs or forcing them to do things that they don't really want to do. So we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to have zero tolerance as a policy.
Okay, so just quick follow-up. How do you implement a zero tolerance policy? How do you ensure that schools are actually following that policy?
By holding the adults responsible and accountable. They cannot turn their heads and look the other way when a child reports that they're being bullied. And that oftentimes happens in Chicago Public School. A child comes to someone in a position of authority, and because they're afraid that they're going to get their tires slashed, they don't take necessary action. We need to have a network from the police department down to the Chicago Public Schools. And it can't be one that's intended to incarcerate youth, but to ensure that we have conflict resolution and that people who are intimidating are dealt with swiftly.
Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, there's a climate survey that's done in all of our schools right now. University of Chicago does this climate survey every 2 years. And what it does is they determine how the kids feel about being in the school, what the schools, the parents, how the parents feel and the teachers feel and the principals feel about each other, and whether the climate is right for learning. I think that's an excellent place for us to measure whether we're winning the battle against bullying or not. And I think that if we use that particular survey, then we could draw from the information from that to determine whether we need direct intervention in this school or is it time for celebration. And I'm all game for celebrating when people are doing better, because when we don't celebrate when we're doing better, then we become more of a punitive kind of body, and we don't want to do that. We want to encourage kids to do the right thing. We want to encourage the adults to do the right thing, and we want to celebrate when we do those things well. Those direct interventions, I believe, should be more about restorative justice, helping kids learn what it costs them and what it costs the student that they're doing the bullying to and how that plays out in their lives. And it should be a way for them to do restitution to the child who has been bullied. And I think with the restorative justice model, we won't engage the police and start criminalizing our kids early on, but we'll teach them responsibility and that there's a price to be paid for when they're doing things that they have no business doing. And as far as the celebration is concerned, I think it should be a school celebration, because it should be a school goal to reduce bullying down to zero in the school. And if they have a drop, they should celebrate, and we should support them.
Carol Mosley-Brown.
Well, a large part of the enforcement has to do, again, with the community engagement. That is to say, the parents, the community activists, to make certain that, to the extent that the CPS has a zero tolerance policy, and it does, but to see to it that the school system gets some support in enforcing that. Zero tolerance, it doesn't just entail that which happens in the school itself, but also in the vicinity of the school. Some schools have actually implemented what they call culture of calm, and the culture of calm programs that are in some of the selective enrollment schools specifically goes a long way to teaching anger management and teaching de-stressing kinds of activities to help young people deal with stress and deal with their own anxieties in constructive and positive ways, as opposed to kicking the kid down 2 lockers down. But enforcement overall is going to take not just the culture of calm inside the school or inside the classroom. It really is going to take the parents and community leaders to create that kind of climate of opinion around the school and engage, and frankly, engage the police as well, not as a punitive, oppressive, occupying force in the schoolyard, but rather as people who are there to help mentor, guide, and otherwise help young people take the right directions.
Quick follow-up, Culture of Calm is a pilot program. It hasn't been rolled out across the school system,
Right.
and it's dependent on federal funds. How would you empower CPS with the resources necessary to do, if that's what you're saying, could be a way of enforcing zero tolerance, to do mediation, anger management with students? Where do you get the money? Where do you get the resources to do that?
Well, you know, and I've given the speech kind of in shorthand before, but the way that schools are funded, it's like a pyramid. I know you know this, but just for everybody else, it's a pyramid with less than 10% of the cost of elementary and secondary education coming out of the federal government. The state has fallen so far behind its constitutional mandate to fully fund education, it's only funding about 20% of the cost of education. All right now comes out, most comes out of the property tax. My view is that if we get engaged and pay attention and actually take a full court press to bring home more federal dollars, to bring home more state dollars, to equalize some of the funding disparities between what the state gives school districts in the rest of Illinois versus what Chicago gets. There are lots of places in which downstate and other districts in the state get funded and we don't. And so if we begin to equalize some of that, that will give us additional resources for the Chicago Public Schools. And then finally, the whole TIF issue, the tax increment financing. A lot of what creates the TIF fund comes out of the hide of District 299, which is our school system.
Okay,
and I
time.
think those funds should go back. Oops, sorry. It was hard to look at you and her at the same time.
That's what I'm here for, to yell time.
Sorry.
Miguel Del Valle.
Well, here's another issue that's been around forever, bullying. And certainly LGBT students have been victims. African American students have been victims. I was bullied in school because I was Latino, and I was one of the first to move into a neighborhood in Chicago that had me going to a school where I had to run out the back door every day in order to avoid getting hit over the head with a bat. And so I learned way back then that the way bullying is dealt with is when a principal and teachers are able to identify it when it's happening and able to act quickly to put a stop to it. But I also believe in restorative justice. I don't believe in kicking kids out of school, suspending them, expelling them. I believe in making sure that the school and it becomes a community, and we call it today fancy names. We call it Culture of Calm. You can call it all kinds of things. But the bottom line is that you need a school that is secure, a school where children get along and where people are respected and all children are supported. And that takes a good leader, a principal that understands, that has the pulse of not just the school but the immediate community, and teachers who are able to identify problems because they've been adequately trained and are adequately supervised to be able to intervene in a timely manner so that the incidents of bullying are diminished and eventually eliminated in any school.
We have come to the end of our forum. So as mayor of Chicago, assuming that is your fate, what other actions will you take to reduce this kind of violence in our communities? Again, we're talking specifically about sexual violence, violence against women and children, and violence against LGBTQ youth. So Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins.
Well, number one, we have to set it as a goal. The goal has to be to reduce violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. If we don't set it as a goal, we will never reach it. We will never solve the problem. We just mess around it. So I think that's why it's important that you all are doing this forum today, because you're bringing it to all of our attention. Now we're making commitments to you today, and that you will be able to hold us accountable for. So setting it as a goal, and then empowering the communities, the research community, and the communities that have to actually implement our ideas, empowering them to get their job done, and providing the support that they need in order to get the job done. And then reporting on our outcomes, whether we're failing or succeeding. It should be a transparent process. It should be real-time reporting, and we should move forward, and we should see ourselves as partners, and not as adversaries, but partners in solving this problem. And that's what I'll do if I am privileged to become your next mayor.
William Duckwells.
We have to give people the tools they need to feel comfortable in their own skin. When people feel comfortable in their own skin, when they have high self-esteem, one, they're less likely to be victims, and two, they're less likely to victimize other people. We have to make certain that people have the wherewithal to really participate in society in a meaningful fashion. It doesn't matter what it is they want to do or how they want to do it. As long as they're not hurting somebody else, we have to become accepting of their particular lifestyle, whatever it is. As long as they're doing something that's positive and constructive, we have to empower them and have to assist them in every way we possibly can. We have to make certain that we don't have government interference in their lives, stopping them from doing the things that they feel comfortable doing as consenting adults, consenting human beings. But in fact, we have to recognize that we weren't placed on this earth to be governed, even though government is a body that makes certain that people feel safe and secure morning, noon, and night.
Miguel del Valle.
Well, we have to continue to reach for perfection. By that I mean we have to continue to strive towards creating a culture of acceptance. And I don't like to use the word tolerance. I really don't like that word because it says, okay, I'll put up with you almost. No, it's a culture of acceptance. It's embracing the diversity that we have in our city, and we don't have that. What we have is economic and racial segregation in the city of Chicago. What we have are 77 community areas instead of one city. What we have is downtown and then the neighborhoods instead of one city. And when we move towards becoming one in the city of Chicago, and we have people embracing each other, no matter what their income levels are, and not being in isolation and sometimes isolating themselves by establishing neighborhoods or areas of the cities that are exclusive for one particular group, even though technically they're not exclusive, but the feeling of exclusivity is there. Once we stop that and we move towards that full acceptance, then I think behavior changes.
Sorry. Carol Mosley-Braun.
Well, at the outset, I'd like to thank Professor Krent, the Dean of the Law School here, for convening this program, and for Ms. Majmudar for her organizing of it, and to you, Ms. Cuddy, for moderating this forum, and to all of you for coming. I was really kind of very impressed with the kind of turnout this program has had. It says that there's a lot of people who take these issues very seriously, who are very concerned about it, and want to move in the direction of solving this problem that is a scourge on our community. The Maori people of New Zealand would say that we create the future by our actions in present time. And by being here tonight, by having this conversation, I hope that this means that we are creating a future in which there will be less violence of any sort, but particularly sexually oriented violence, sexually motivated violence, that we will be able to put an end to that scourge in this community and be able to create an environment here in Chicago of one in which people recognize that this kind of violence is simply not acceptable as a matter of community values. Thank you.
Thanks again to our candidates, Carol Mosley-Braun, Miguel del Valle, William Walls, and Patricia Van Pelt-Watkins for participating this evening. Thanks to all of you. We do have some closing remarks from Dawn Dalton. She's the Executive Director of Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network. Dawn.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you to all the candidates. Another round of applause for them coming out tonight. As you can see, this is an issue that matters to the constituents in Chicago, so we are very appreciative of your time to come and talk with us about your views. And on the anniversary of Susan B. Anthony's birthday today, please remember to vote. Thank you very much.